Good morning, class. Today we're going to be talking about ethics of war and warfare. But before we jump into that, we probably need to cover a little bit of class business, as this is coming up real quick. Um, our paper is going to be due a week from Sunday. Next week is our last week of lectures. So our paper will be due at the last week of that by midnight, and that's going to be a paper that you guys email me to me. Now, I started to hear some chatter back from you guys about the paper. Just people asking questions and thinking about topics, and all that's awesome. Please do not forget that you can send me a rough draft. I will probably cap the day. Probably cap the day. I will take a rough draft to grade it and give it back to you, or proof it. Yeah, I won't give it a grade, but proof it and give it back to you. I'll probably cap that on maybe like Tuesday of next week. So if you send me a rough draft by Tuesday, I will have enough time to look over it, proof it, give you feedback, and get it back to you with enough time to make changes as you see fit. So try to make sure you're thinking about that. If some people said, "Oh, I want to make sure my grade's good. I want to make sure I do a good job." Well, this is the way. Send me a rough draft, and I'll give you feedback. Um, get the work done early rather than sending it in at the last minute. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is the final that will be coming up. It should be up in 2 weeks. Yeah. It'll be just like the midterm. It's a very similar format. We're going to have a series of short questions followed by two essays. I can tell you that it's going to be like the midterm where it's open note, open text. The only caveats being um, you don't go to Wikipedia. If I ask you, since we're talking about war, what is pacifism? And if you copy and paste me the first two lines of Wikipedia, I'm just gonna, okay, that's plagiarism. That's not cool. And you can fail the whole test that way. So don't do that. Don't do that. Just because it's open note, open text doesn't mean you don't have to think for yourself and write for yourself. But otherwise, make sure you look over the midterm. I think you guys can still do that. I'm pretty sure I gave you access. So if you can't look over the midterm, shoot me an email. But I think I set it so that everyone can see, what the questions were. Some of those questions will be reused. Um, there will be two short essays, and I'm also going to put up a study guide. And the study guide will just kind of be my own rehashing of all the various theories that we've looked at. And again, it's good to pull from the study guide, but if anyone copies and pastes from the study guide, that's plagiarism of me, and that would be annoying. So, all right, I think that's all the business we have. I want us to talk about warfare a little bit. Um, what is war? I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans this past weekend for Thanksgiving, and there's obviously this gigantic production that's taking place there. Uh, they're trying to tell us a story, but between the helicopters and the planes and the B-52 bombers, the P-52, P-42 like Spitfires, the mortars and everything else you walk through. Tons of riflery and uniforms and etc. etc. You get a sense of what this war was, how it was being fought. But the great pervasive absence, perhaps, was really trying to figure out why World War II was fought. I found like there's this lack of presentation. Maybe they just didn't have the time. Maybe people just aren't as interested in that sort of display. Um, but uh, what really made this war take place? What made it happen? We know that Hitler and the Nazis. They were this territorial, aggressive, expansive. But what made them that way? What made them desire to conquer all of Europe? Um, and how is that different from we look very favorably upon Napoleon and his imperial interests. Is it because of the genocide? Well, that probably has a lot to do with it. But even without the whole Holocaust side of World War II, um, we have the axis of evil that the Allies fought against, the fascists. Um, but what really held that coalition together? Italy and Germany and Japan, and what motivated them, and what motivated our sort of response, and how is that different from the way we respond to people today? Uh, I don't know. Something for us to think about. Not just because D-Day. Not D-Day. Pearl Harbor is coming up. The anniversary of Pearl Harbor, um, where we can sit and solemnly reflect upon that attack. But war is always being bandied about, tossed about casually in conversation. War with Russia, war with Libya. But I don't know if we necessarily think critically about what war means and what war is doing. So, Karl van Clausewitz argued that war is the continuation of policy by other means. Um, and by that we mean that all warfare is about governance. Who gets power? Who gets represented? Whose ideals prevail? What laws are enacted? What is taught in school? We know the phrase, history is written by the victors. And that's a very, very true sentiment. Um, as we have found, you know, like the story of World War II. Like the story of World War II. Um, one of the reasons that the U.S. was so slow to join World War II that it took an act of the act of Pearl Harbor just to drag us into the war, whereupon Hitler declared war on us first. Um, but one of the reasons that initially the Americans were so slow, um, in my opinion, even though I'm not like a World War II expert, is that there was a large amount of Americans who supported either fascism. There was a large amount of Americans that supported eugenics. So when Hitler starts talking about the master race, that resonates with people. There was a large amount of Americans that just flat out supported Germany, the German American alliance. Um, and so, early on in World War II, while Hitler is kind of knocking the socks off France and Norway and Sweden and pretty much everyone but the Swiss, there was a lot of positive German feelings towards that. Positive American feelings toward that. There was a schism in our leadership about what should be done. Um, do we side with Britain, or do we, at some level, side with the fascists? But history writes itself, and um, obviously Hitler lost, and the fascists are now seen as unequivocally evil. And so we kind of erase a little bit of that history. Americans weren't dabbling in fascism. Um, Americans weren't dabbling in eugenics, even though I've seen the sort of legal proposals being written by people to this governor of Louisiana advocating creation of eugenics laws. Um, no, no, no. They weren't doing anything like the Nazi Germans were. That's what the evil people were doing. America was, the democracy. Um, they were true and noble and pure. And the point of that whole thing is that because Americans have um, won the fight, they now have that privilege to that option to kind of rewrite history, to create the story that they see fit. Some of it buried in truth, some of it buried in propaganda. There should be nothing that we're unfamiliar with. But warfare is about, again, it's about when a uh, when words fail, when diplomacy fails, when a nation cannot get its way um, through what most people would consider appropriate channels, they turn to warfare. Warfare is when we're just doing the same thing that we've always been doing, pursuing our own interests, um, just by a new method. When Americans had this vision of manifest destiny and they pushed themselves to the West Coast, that started off as just a fiat policy. It was just move to the West. Here's the Homestead Act. Um, and upon following said edict, people were brought into conflict. But in order to continue and complete that spirit, that policy of manifest destiny that Americans ought to own and control everything from the East Coast to the West Coast, warfare was created in order to continue that policy. So before we look at a couple different theories about war, I just want to talk very briefly about how, terminologically speaking, how wars are fought. Because there's going to be a couple terms we use. So on one hand, we have what we call direct violence. And this should be pretty obvious, pretty opaque. Direct violence is, you know, we are going to war with you, and we are going to shoot you in the face. And all of our army marches over next to your army, and we start shooting each other in the face. And this is warfare. Very direct, very straightforward. This is the dropping of bombs. The planes, the howitzers, the navies, the submarines. This is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which again, strangely, was very absent from World War II Museum. They just had one little nook in the corner as you were leaving. My family thought it was because the museum is trying to be PC, and us using the bomb is not very PC. Um, I don't know. I don't know if I buy that reason, but it was very notably absent for being probably the most important thing of World War II, the use of the atomic bomb. But that's a scene of direct violence, obviously. Now, another way wars are fought are through what we would call threats of violence or indirect violence. Um, the key example that we can call to is the Cold War. During the Cold War era, the USSR, which is now Russia, In America, we're having this big tiff. Is it going to be communism or capitalism? Which form of market economies is going to be stronger? Which nation is going to be stronger? Who's going to be in control as the reigning superpower of the world? Now, because of the atomic bomb that both nations had at their disposal, neither nation wanted to engage. Neither nation wanted to engage in warfare because that threat of the atomic bomb was so real. If we happen to go after America and they drop a bomb on us, we'll have to drop bombs on them, and the entire world will explode in a nuclear holocaust. Um, Very real threat. We started to disarm, but there was a time and point where I think it was something astronomical that between America and the USSR, we had enough nuclear bombs to destroy the world 20,000 times over, which might be more than the one required to kill us all. I don't know. I was never good at math. But it was under this looming specter of, they called it MAD, mutually assured destruction. It was under that specter that the Cold War went on. And so the U.S. got involved in Vietnam, Russia got involved in Afghanistan, and we had proxy wars, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we never went after each other directly, and in doing so, all we did um, was participate in these more or less threats of violence. This indirect violence that we're doing. We're not gonna line up our enemies and shoot each other, but we're gonna sit there and threaten to do that until one side backs down, or one side can't afford to play the game anymore. That's really what brought about the end of the Cold War. The Russian economy could not afford to play the game of militarization um, at the stakes necessary to keep up with, the U.S. and NATO. So, we won that one, kinda, sure. I mean, clearly we did, but won through a very different way. You know, we did not shoot any Russian citizens or Russian soldiers. Instead, um, we outspent Russian citizens and Russian soldiers. And that's a very important distinction to think about when it comes to warfare, um, especially in the 20th century. No longer do we look for the days of the dramatic singular battles where the tide shifts, everything turns, um, and through the brilliant tactics and heroism, through the brilliant tactics and heroism, we are, able to win the day. When we're thinking about wars in the 20th century, we need to think about wars in the context of production. Because if they were thought about in the context of the battle, Americans would have definitely lost. Definitely would have lost World War II. One of our first real, that heroic battle that we're thinking about actually took place in North Africa, where Rommel earned for himself the nickname the Desert Fox, Rommel being a German commander who so thoroughly outwitted and outflanked American and British forces at the Kaisermer Pass that they were thoroughly routed and forced to retreat entirely, breaking their entire lines, killing many. Um, but war is not about battles anymore, it's about production. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit at the end about the military industrial complex. War is about production. And even though America has, probably now, I would definitely say the best trained army, um, best trained Air Force, Navy, Marines. When we look back into World War II, we clearly had inferior everything. We had inferior everything. The one thing that we were probably not inferior upon was our aircraft carriers. But otherwise, yes, our soldiers, our tanks, our guns were at best they were mass produced, but um, they may have lacked a little bit of the sophistication that was happening. We were using bombers. Germany was using cruise missiles. The V-2 already in production um, by midway through World War II. Anyways, the whole point being is that um, the difference between American production and German production is that American production was virtually endless. So that when it came to World War II, Americans did not out strategize, outperform. Instead, Americans outproduced. For every one tank they destroyed with their Tiger tanks, we would produce 10 more. So, a German tank battalion, though superior, significantly superior, um, would ultimately just fail because they didn't have the means of production, to borrow that term from our economic lecture, the means of production necessary to stem the tide. And so this is what happened in the Cold War. America kept saying, we're going to produce and produce and produce and produce. And then when Reagan got into office, Reagan said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to produce even more. And Russia saying, well, we have to produce more to keep up, otherwise we fall behind. You'll fall behind, and we won't have the threats that they'll have. And if we don't have those threats, then real war. But by that point, the Russian economy had been so hollowed out by the years of production, military production, without the necessary resources to back it up, that Russia essentially went bankrupt. Now, there's a third type of violence, other than just direct violence or threats of violence, and this is what we call slow violence. Slow violence is a term by Richard Frost, and it's intended to describe the unseen effects of violent occurrences. So, if we look at the first Gulf War, and we think about that war where most of you guys hopefully were almost being born, um, early 90s, 89, 90. But we're looking at the Persian Gulf War, and we're marching through the sands, and we get to Baghdad, and we crush Iraq, but we don't depose Saddam. So we have this very successful war. But what we do after that is that we enact a sort of cease and desist to anyone who's wanting to bring aid or trade to that nation. We prevent people from rebuilding hospitals, from rebuilding roads, from redistributing medicine, because we put more or less an embargo on the entire nation as a sort of punishment for war. Now, when we're shooting our missiles and shooting the army, we kill, probably a few thousands. The estimated death toll in the years following the Persian Gulf War, because of economic sanctions, from material sanctions, because of the damage to infrastructure, the inability for the nation to transmit power, transmit clean water, to function as a nation. We can just see a small sliver of this in Flint, where they have bad drinking water. Now imagine if your entire country was like that. But because all of their crucial infrastructure has been destroyed, and there is an embargo on the sort of trade and whatnot that allow it to be rebuilt, The estimated death toll is in the millions. Um, Over the course of the next several years. People who just, you know, can't get what they need to survive because you're living in a desert and not a whole lot of places to grow food, but maybe food can't come in. And so that sort of unseen, hidden violence is what we're referring to as this sort of slow violence. Slow violence. Um, the sort of after effects, the rippling after effects of a violent epicenter. And of course, classic example would be something like Hiroshima, where we have this very visible boom, bang, bomb is hit, and catastrophic destruction as far as the eye can see. And this is the sort of violence we're accustomed to. Yeah, explosions, boom, everyone's dead. That's violence. But in the decades following, the increase in cancer rates, birth defects, mutations, that's the sort of slow violence that we don't see, that you have to go back and find. The sort of violence that hides only to reveal itself later, maybe even worse than the original. And that is how wars are fought as well. Um, there's definitely at least one known case where a person wrote down that he like deliberately uh, gave a blanket of smallpox to the Native Americans. But we assume historians have started to piece together that might have happened multiple times to deliberately infect over the coming years um, many peoples with deadly diseases. Sort of slow violence that we're enacting upon them. So keep that in mind. Those are going to be some terms that might get bandied about throughout the rest of the lecture, but very important when we're thinking about, when we're talking about war, especially in today's day, what sort of war are we talking about? What sort of violence are we talking about? So I want to look at three different theories of war. Um, First one is probably the one that we're most familiar with. It's what we call a just war theory. Um, and this is just way people think about, how wars should be fought. When should we fight wars? What makes war right? Just war theory says, um, it is okay. It is okay to fight a war when the war is being fought not on your aggression, but against the aggression of others. Um, so this is our World War II mentality. America did not bomb Pearl Harbor. Well, I mean, what America did to preempt that move was um, cease the flow of gasoline and steel to Japan. Kind of cut off the supply to Japan. And so Japan's saying, oh my God, we don't have the resources to take care of anything if we don't have this oil and this gasoline, this steel and this gasoline coming in. Can't build more ships. So the only way to get it is to go get it from America. America did something diplomatically. Japan's response was, I'm going to bomb you. And then, of course, Hitler the next day said, ha ha ha, it is time for us to attack the Americans as well. Um, a decision that made no sense, but hey, it worked. For us, not him, of course. But it was this, again, like, America is sitting there saying, huh. So we were like, we're not going to sell you gasoline because you're using it to murder Chinese people. Um, and so you bomb us and your friends declare war on us, and okay, sure. If that's the war you want, that's the war we will fight. Now, if you look at American history, it might be the only war we fought like that. When you look at Vietnam, when you look at Korea, we can say that oh, we're fighting off the aggression of blah blah blah, but most of the time may not be the case. Never such a clear cut. These folks are coming to invade us, coming to kill us. Let us protect ourselves. Um, so World War II becomes this sort of emblem of what just war theory is all about. And it becomes a very tough case for us to reconcile, like when someone says pacifism, which we will look at. Pacifism, you're like World War II. Sure, it's easy to be a pacifist when Vietnam is going on, and you're like, so there's these jungles in Northeast Asia. Why the hell are we there? What are we doing? Oh, we're fighting against the communist ideology. You're like, we're fighting against ideas? Can't we do that with like a book or something? No. And so, uh, issues or thoughts like pacifism become really, really popular later on in American war history because we start to fight all these wars that aren't like World War II, which is this sort of super clear cut case of we're coming for you and we're coming to kill your nation. We're going to topple you like we toppled France, and Belgium, and Benelux, and Norway, and we're trying to topple Britain. Um, but this is what just war theory is all about. When it says aggression, it says aggression ought to be stopped. And when another nation engages in these sorts of aggressive acts, they surrender their own rights against said aggression. So once Germany crosses that threshold, crosses that barrier, and aggressively strikes out, they lose the right. They surrender their own right against people's aggressive acts towards them. It's the key of just war theory. Um, Often talked about, what is being done in the name of defense, what is being done to safeguard against aggression, but oftentimes not necessarily. It's up to us to decide whether or not it lives up to the merits of a just war. Because now we have this term that gets bandied about quite a bit. We'd say the war in Afghanistan was a just war. The war in Iraq was a just war. And we have to think, does that fit with this classical approach, a war to stop the aggression of other nations? Stop the aggression of other nations. Or does that sort of warfare more aptly fit in with what we're going to look at next, which is a realist approach to warfare? And this approaches war not from a moral position, but just as a position of power and autonomy. And to be cold about this, the realist approach says we're not going to fight this war because we're right. We're going to fight this war because it's what benefits us the most. And we talked about this a little bit. We talked about this as a sort of example of this. The kind of dilemma of Americans in the response to Afghanistan and the response to 9/11. The average Afghanistan individual, not only are they probably functionally illiterate, but they're just out in the boonies. They're small cities of goat herders, farmers. We're not talking about people that are living in, a giant metropolis like Chicago. These urban areas do not exist. These are the back hill mountains, the foothills of the Himalayas. And so when we talk about all these individuals and this American army, this American war machine that swooped into Afghanistan to take out the Taliban, all the people are getting caught up in this, and what do we do about that? How do we respond? What is moral? What is ethical in the warfare that's sucking in an entire nation because we had a beef with the Taliban? Um, People who don't even know that 9/11 took place. People who don't even know, when they polled them, the majority of Afghanistanis were kind of did not know what 9/11 was. Not just yeah. So we have this military machine rolling into this small back hills, backwoods country that has a history of knowing how to defend itself because of how what the Russians did to them in the 70s. Um, but we're trying to depose the Taliban, and the everyday individual living there has no clue what's going on other than, all right, people are here to invade us again. Let us take up arms. Now, the just war theorists might say, man, we're not fighting a just war here. Uh, Whatever acts of aggression happened during 9/11 happened from the seat of individuals. And this nation, where its people don't even know what's going on, clearly do not meet that criteria. But a realist would say, it's not about right and wrong. This is about showing the world American power. This is about satisfying American thirst for vengeance. Um, this is about maintaining, letting everyone know, not the Afghanis, because, again, the majority of them are goat herders. Um, we're not telling the Afghanis anything because we're not worried about them. We're telling everyone else that we are still the superpower. We are the autonomous nation. We are in control of the fate of the world. And to attempt for even a second to usurp that is to bring down the full wrath and might of the American military. Hopefully, we can see how that differs from sort of just war theory. The question of right and wrong does not come into play. The only question that comes into play is who's in charge, who has control, who has power. What are we trying to accomplish? Does it make sense to go to war to accomplish that? Yes, then we go to war. You know, all is fair in love and war. And so whatever we do, again, it's kind of the history is written by the victors. Whatever we do is justified in maintaining our own hegemony, and it will be justified because we will have the capacity to write it as justified. Um, Again, how we think about Hiroshima. Now you can go back and look at the propaganda that was being published at the time. Um, when we dropped the bombs, we said that we were dropping these atomic bombs on military production facilities. Um, but, looking at the communiques, these targets were chosen because we knew they weren't military facilities. They were being chosen because they were dense population centers that hadn't been bombed already. Like Tokyo had already been destroyed many times over. Um, it suffered the same sort of bombings that London had suffered from the Germans. Um, so we chose Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the point of that was making an example of all these civilians, all these people. Um, and it's tough to say whether it's right or wrong. It's tough to say if it does it at that point still continue to conform to just war theory, or have we breached this ground and started taking on um, this idea of we will do whatever we need to assert ourselves, whatever we need to assert ourselves. Um, and likewise, the American Indian Wars, another example of this sort of realist approach, where We were the aggressors. We were the ones driving people out of their lands. We were the ones who sort of said, look, America needs to be whole. We need that land. Get out. We'll give you a trade. Okay, this trade is no longer working for us. Let us do take a little more and take a little more until we, had firmly um, displaced the Native American population here and put them into reservations, killing them all along the way. I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with this sort of history, but this is not even a question of just war theory. It's just naked pursuit of policy, the continuation of policy by other means. Final approach, again, is pacifism. And I've brought this up a couple times, and not necessarily, I'm not intending to be dismissive of it at all. Um, in the context of something like the Nazis, it is really tough. Where do we stand? How do we articulate an argument that says, I will not take up arms against anyone? There are no grounds where war is the justifiable response to aggression, especially the sort of totalizing war. Um, Even when we think about, historical pacifists like Gandhi. Gandhi, he at one point said, if we had any other weapons than pacifism, we would use them. If they had had the bomb, they would have used the bomb in their struggle to overcome Britain. Um, so pacifism remains this sort of contentious uh, place where we say the only approach to war is to not have war. Uh, but how do we respond in these situations where um, naked aggression is being thrown at us? How do we respond? And do we even approve of said responses? Let's look at, terrible as this sounds, let's look at the sort of Jewish response to aggression. Um, the Jewish response to aggression in World War II. We start rounding up all the people and placing them in these internment camps. Starts off by putting them in the ghetto. There were places where the Jewish people struck back and said no. This sort of thing will not stand. We're not going to let you round us up like cattle, and God knows what else. Because obviously at that point they weren't. No one was foreseeing the Holocaust, just the sort of rampant mistreatment and abuse. Um, and so we see that take place. And we see some people respond with, look, that sort of aggression is not cool. We have to stand up for ourselves. But we saw the overwhelming majority of the European Jewish population just kind of go with it. Go into the point where they, were put into these showers and executed. And is that all because of um, how unfathomable it was, or is there something that says, we don't meet aggression with aggression at any point? But I don't know. Pacifism is one of those things that I often think about. Like, warfare is the tool of the weak because they cannot accomplish what they desire to accomplish through diplomacy, civility, um, planning, and thinking. You can't do what you need to do as a human being, so instead you start throwing rocks at people. I mean, that's kind of a good analogy. That's how the pacifists see war. We see war as a failure. War is the point where we cannot achieve our goals without killing and hurting and reaching this state of total war where nations are being destroyed. And we should always see that as a failure. Um, but seeing something as a failure and not participating in it is a very different thing. Because, when it's your nation, your family, your friends, they're at risk. How do you not support that at some level? Okay, so the last thing we're not going to have time to talk about terrorism today, unfortunately. We'll probably get that into that when we're looking at globalism next week, which will be our final week of lectures. Um, but when it comes to war, uh, we have reached a scale of warfare in the 20th century that uh, where we cannot really see as individuals size and scope. When we're thinking about how many people died in World War II, the American cost was very small, very very small compared to most of these other nations. I think Germany, we'd have to look up these numbers. Germany's along the lines of like 9 million. Russia was along the lines of 20 million. Then you factor in the Holocaust, which is another 6 million Jews, another 6 million Gypsies, Poles, whatever else they were rounding up because, they didn't fit their model of the Aryan. Um, but these numbers have already reached staggering proportions. Numbers that are far larger than the city of Chicago. Mountains of death. Mountains of death that defy our ability to comprehend them. And that's definitely, we try to in some ways, I think, incorporate scope. We try to, we'll show pictures of the suffering kid burning with napalm, running naked through Vietnam. We'll talk about that. Um, but, we see that sort of suffering as the maybe remarkable, when in reality that's the inordinately common. Um, inordinately common. Now, war is a class conflict. When we're thinking about who fights and who dies and who wins and who doesn't, war is class conflict. Because, again, with even looking at our nation, we have a volunteer army. And so the only time that, you know, after 9/11, I know I had a bunch of friends, that, not a bunch, but a handful of friends that joined the army out of that swell of patriotism. People that come from, the upper class, sons of doctors and bankers. But for the overwhelming majority, uh, you know, the military is populated by people of the middle class and lower middle class, or even the lower class here in America. People that they're not going to go to college and have everything paid for by mom and dad. People that are not going to go on a full ride. Um, and so already in the conscription of our army, we have a sort of crisis here. Because we're starting to pull from not the whole population, from a segment of the population, a very specifically targeted segment of the population. And this causes a sort of conflict of interests in what our army is trying to do. Because on one hand, the army is actually providing like maybe ways out of poverty through the GI bills and providing opportunities, which is an awesome thing. But it's also um, turning into a method, and this is where we're talking about war as a profit machine, turning into a method of making money, turning into a method of making money for that upper class. One of the biggest criticisms during the second Gulf War was looking at Dick Cheney, the vice president's relationship with his company Halliburton. The company that, we're getting all these young soldiers together after 9/11 to invade Iraq, and coincidentally, um, building bombs from the company that Dick Cheney owned. Funneling billions and billions and billions of dollars of profit into that company. Profit that comes from our tax dollars. And this is what Dwight Eisenhower, general of World War II, uh, turned American president, warned us about. He warned us that our military was becoming so large that it was becoming an entity into its own right. A third wing or third leg of an American economy. So that the only way to support the economy and support America is to continually um, buy more for the military. And this is a challenge. This is a challenge that we face in our modern era, where an overwhelming majority. I mean, we spend more than something like the next 50 largest militaries combined in the world as the largest military in the world. Um, Most of those countries are even our allies. We spend more than all of our allies put together. It's crazy. And we spend all this money in order to generate money for, well, not all of us, but for a select few that kind of have benefited from this perpetual state of warfare. Um, Another reason that we are probably experiencing a sort of shift against the sentiments of warfare as of late. Um, but war is creating profit. Profit that is definitely not necessarily benefiting the whole, but benefiting individuals. Uh, Anyways, I'm going to leave it here. Keep in mind again, war is a continuation of policy by other means. Keep in mind those three forms of violence: direct, indirect, and slow violence. Keep in mind these three different approaches, whether it's just war, which is kind of like a moral application of war theory, the realist approach, or the pacifist approach. Um, Keep in mind your paper as we're thinking about that. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. Sorry if I was slow in getting back to things last week. I had been traveling for the holidays. Even had a little breakdown on my way back, which is why things are moving a little late this week. Um, so everyone take care, and next week we'll be looking at globalism.